Hello and welcome back. It's the first video of the new year, and today we're going to be discussing the reasonability versus rationality paradigm. And the original thought behind this is the question with, are we rational, and why do people disagree fundamentally when ideally there should be an empirical way of coming to conclusions when it comes to the world of politics at large. And yes, new Q-zip, ditching the hoodie for the new year. But we're going to talk about a little thought experiment first, and then talk about different issues which cause polarization in the world, and then discuss why this fundamental difference has happened, and I'm going to break down why I believe that this is a very fundamentally important issue that not a lot of us can actually grasp from the get-go. So the first issue I want to raise that causes a lot of polarization in today's world is the issue of abortion. And I'm not going to fully explain it because I'm sure most people are quite aware of what that is. But the issue comes around with two different axes: the right of the unborn child and the right of the woman to choose what to do with their bodily autonomy. And these are two different issues. Like the first one obviously has to do with the fundamental right to life, and which is inherent in, I think, being a living being, right, due to self-preservation. And then the second is the right to bodily autonomy, which is also important, women or not, due to the principle that for anything to happen, you have to have the right to yourself, and that kind of thing prevents slavery, bondage, all that different kind of thing. And the reason why this is a polarizing issue is because people can't quite decide what is the right thing to do. Which do we provide full autonomy? Do we have restrictions? Do we have all restrictions? Do we have some sort of middle ground? And what has happened over time is the conversation has strayed away from what actually matters and what the actual fundamental idea is, because both sides have parts of it that they don't exactly understand, or on the other hand, don't exactly quite acknowledge. And the fundamental issue behind the abortion issue is, of course, the idea of whether or not a fetus is the right to live. Or, sorry, it is a life or not, whether or not an unborn infant is actually a living being or a living human being. Because there's a lot of different things to consider. For example, there's the fact that, again, killing a pregnant woman is considered a double homicide, especially in the case of the vehicular kinds. On the other hand, it's really, there is no other legal documentation or otherwise, non-empirical way of actually qualifying an infant or a fetus as a life. And so while we debate so much, while we have all these conversations and modern discourse about what should we prioritize more, the real question is whether or not both sides actually agree on the fundamental ideas, which is not on whether or not abortion is sinful or whatever, which is the presuppositional presup something apologetics, right? The question should be, right, whether or not one side's fundamental ideas is valid, because a lot of times you're going to see, right, from the more conservative, the anti-abortion wing, you're going to see that saying, fetuses are life, they are human life, and therefore they are inherently valuable, and therefore abortion is immoral and unethical, which is a perfectly valid assessment. And on the other side, there is the equally valid assessment, reasonable assessment, reasonable, reasonable assessment, that in fact the fetus is not a life, and such, that we should prioritize the life and well-being of the mother, which is, of course, has its own, things here and there. For example, most people agree that in cases where abortion is completely necessary and there's no chance of actual birth to actually have and save the life of the woman, then yes, a lot of people do agree that is the right thing to do. However, this changes when you get to the extremes, which is going to be the absolutely yes and absolutely no, and that is where the polarization happens, right? Because a lot of Americans can agree, for example, that there's a reasonable thing that we should try to achieve. However, not a lot of people stop to consider beyond themselves is, am I in the rational position? Am I rational? Right, little bug there. And this is where the problem comes in, because both sides debate as if they are the rational ones on the issue, as many humans tend to do, as it is typical for us to believe that we are correct in these issues, right? And as this develops, what happens is that things that are true, not on the individual level, are often ignored. despite empiricism, despite all of these things that helps us find truth and and all these different ideas, when it comes to ethics and morality, that kind of thing kind of blurs, and we all believe that we are rational, that we are the ones operating within logic, without the actual empirical proof to actually believe so. And which this is why I believe that the abortion issue is quite silly, and the polarization is for no reason. And perhaps media has a reason to do with this as well, but it's completely blown out of proportion. So many people talk about, like hating babies or birth and hating life, or on the other hand, hating women and hating freedom and hating rights. When the real issue, it really comes down to the fact that both sides, depending on when it's convenient or not, disregard the issue, the fundamental issue of whether or not a child is, or I keep same words, fetus is a child, right? And so what this reveals is that, abortion is just one issue, by the way. I'm not accusing one side or the other, but probably the left is more the culprit in this specific issue. But the issue is more about how we're unable to actually see beyond our own illusions that we are rational as humans and to grasp reasonable grounds, which is how politics works in the first place. Because when we all believe we're rational, there's very little to change. Because the idea with empiricism and fundamental, just basics of the world and science is that these are things that everyone can agree on, and thus that everyone should operate based upon. There's a reason that, flat earthers are no longer part of the conversation because they're unhelpful to actually discussing the matters of the earth and gravity and such. And they've been long since, it's been long since that has been the case. But the problem with this is that it's very difficult to see where you are going wrong if you are truly believing that you are rational, and thus that your position is rational. And that is the main problem. One's own belief that one is rational leaks into the belief that one's beliefs are rational as well, not only one's logical capabilities. Because in many ways, humans are logical, rational actors when it comes to self-interest. When it comes to things that are not directly of our self-interest, rationality becomes very difficult because there are so many different things like social issues, peer pressure, status issues. Right? There's a lot of things that inhibit our rationality when it comes to issues that are not actually of direct importance to us. Because here's the thing, no one's going to ever lie and fake about things if it has their own life in danger, especially when it comes to, things like, I guess, anything related to self-preservation, right? Doesn't even have to be in politics. Why was that behind me the whole time? And where this brings us right now is the idea of reasonability. So we've already just, whether or not we're rational is not even a question to be asked. Humans are rational when it comes to our own self-interest, but when it comes to the self-interest of others, there are often other factors at play. We've all heard of the term virtue signaling. This is an example of rationality not being really applied to a political position or anything. And, of course, virtue signaling goes for both sides. People who, you know, bow their head down to social justice or Christian apologetics, right? These are all different, or fundamentalism. These are all different ways of being irrational to curry social favor. And what's really more what's really more desirable is reasonability, which is much, much more preferable over the belief of rationality in policy and politics, because that is how things operate already, but it takes a lot to actually have people believe in that as well. For example, very little is done in government that is of major importance that is extremely, extremely one-sided. You're not going to very rarely get 100-0 senatorial vote, or like a 435-0, right? And that means that there's some sort of common ground that must be reached, and that is done through reasonability. Because here's the thing, if both sides are rational and they truly believe they're rational, then there can quite literally be no pleasant discourse or even a result. Because if you are right, if I am right, why would I compromise with you who is wrong? And it is this firm belief, not in the fact that, there are better options perhaps ahead of us, or that there are, alternatives, or that there is common ground that is beyond the binary opposites. Well, then you're not getting anywhere. If you don't believe that that's the case, then you're not getting anywhere. And the case is that, in politics, you're gonna have to find a way to find common ground, to be reasonable with each other. And employing these tactics in the real world is more or less the actual difficult part of this, because there is the part of introspection which is not readily available to a lot of people, either due to inexperience or inability. But being introspective and reasoning out the reasons why you believe something helps break down rationality, or the phantom rational you have within yourself. And that's, I think, the first step to actually mending some of this polarization in this world, which is the idea that your ideas are justified and rational, even despite evidence and even despite popular opinion, is simply wrong. The idea that you are simply correct and that you are a rational actor and therefore your beliefs are rational and logically supported is not correct. It is much better to be reasonable, which is within the social status of whatever, environment you are in, which actually allows you to make progress by finding something that actually works with other people, because a strict adherence to ideological rationality, right, that phantom rationality we're talking about, is inherently the reason why a lot of people disagree fundamentally, and they don't even realize it. Because there's a lot of things with each issue that highlight the fundamental issues, but there are so many more things that don't. And again, I'm just going to using this as the most provocative example, but abortion, right? There are so many provocative and, unnecessary, non-fundamental issues being discussed. Like, for example, at least in the scope of America, at least, women's rights. That is not within the scope of whether or not a fetus is, a life worth having. Because, believe it or not, due to the civil rights movements and every progress that has been made since, there is no difference in rights, especially to bodily autonomy from either sex. However, the fundamental issue of whether or not a fetus is a child has still not been properly, ingrained as a fundamental truth in the American zeitgeist. Even though the fact is, empirically, technically, a fertilized embryo is a human life, scientifically speaking. However, it is still within the public's interest, and it is in our reasonable interest to pursue a reasonable definition of whether or not that actually qualifies, or whether or not there should be some other standard set. So a good example of this would be that reasonability, right? There was a Supreme Court decision which officially ruled in like the 1870s, when it had to do with tariffs, that tomatoes were, I want to say, a vegetable. Hold up. Yeah, Nix v. Hedon. Yes, tomatoes are legally vegetables, even though the fact is a scientific consensus, obviously, it says that tomatoes are fruits. Now, what does that tell us? This tells us that there's a lot to do with reasonability versus rationality. The most fervent person advocating for tomatoes or fruits, it doesn't matter. What matters is that people were able to reasonably come together and say, oh, yeah, this is not a fruit. This is not like an apple. This is like, I don't know, anything else that's a vegetable. And it might not be correct. It might not be rational, but it is reasonable. And that is what we are in pursuit of. The ability to realize that one's rationality is not concrete. It's the ability, more or less, to realize that one's rationality is only determined by one's own belief in their own rationality will help. That belief will help to break down the boundaries as people realize that the things they're talking about are not actually relevant to finding a reasonable solution. And I'm kind of talking in circles here, right? We're going through a lot of the same ideas. But I do believe that this is really key, because employing these tactics in the real world is necessary. Introspection is necessary, and I want to make a video about this in the future, which I don't know how that will come by. I'm, trying to write this book and everything, right? But the loss of introspection in our society due to, I think, the lack of reading, I want to say, because, you get to see the internal thoughts and such, whatever. The lack of introspection that we have as a society has led a lot of people to not be able to realize the reason why they believe things, and the reason why things work despite the rational grounds they assume themselves to be working on. And this stretches from every single mostly social issues, but every social issue to even political, to actual real political ones, where people's con- convictions is the thing that's hurting people, without the fact, you can be passionate, by the way, without having to be under this rational illusion. You can be extremely passionate about something while also being introspective and realizing the reasons why you believe things and the holes in your arguments and the flaws that you have, despite the fact that you still believe it. And that's not even contradictory. You can simply have the beliefs while understanding, because understanding why you believe something makes you more open to change. Change for the better, change for the reasonable. Because when you understand, I believe fundamental X, which has led me over time to believe in opinion Y, instead of trying to go over the semantics of opinion Y, you can simply have a conversation about fundamental X. And that is an easier way to actually convince someone and to actually learn than trying to, again, like the abortion issue, be useless and say, like, that any opponent to this hates rights and other people hates babies, right? And that is the essence of what the whole rationality reasonability paradigm is, because understanding and being able to be introspective that humans are not rational when it comes to social issues that do not impact the self directly, then it is only reasonable to actually pursue an introspective, reasonability based approach to making decisions. Now, of course, the caveat with that original statement I made is that you can be, even if it is with self interest, you can absolutely be deceptive. But it is rational for you to be deceptive in that case. However, in cases when it's just, in cases defined, like I said earlier, where it doesn't actually have to do with self interest or self preservation, then rationality basically goes out the window, or there are a million other factors that cause humans to believe things. And understanding why you believe something might be, some weird, but it is something necessary to actually grow as a political thinker. Anyways, this is a little bit rant on this idea I've had for a while. If you have any ideas, again, as always, comment section down below. I'll try to respond. Anyways, it's been Rhetoric Reviewed. Peace.